There is a feeling many people carry quietly today, even if they struggle to describe it. Days pass, yet they do not feel like days. Weeks vanish before they can be remembered. You look back at the past few years and feel as if time itself has folded in on itself, compressing experiences that once felt distant into something uncomfortably close. It is not that more things are happening than before. It is that everything is happening faster than the human mind was ever meant to process. This sensation is not new. More than 14 centuries ago, the Prophet Muhammad spoke of a time when time itself would accelerate. Years would feel like months, months like weeks, days like fleeting moments that slip through the fingers before they can be held. At the time, such words could only be understood spiritually, perhaps metaphorically. Today, they feel disturbingly literal, not because the clock has changed, but because human perception has. Pause for a moment and observe the rhythm of modern life. Information never rests. News cycles overlap. Crises do not resolve before the next one appears. A sense of closure is replaced by permanent anticipation. Even when nothing dramatic is happening, there is an underlying tension, as if something is always about to happen. This constant state of alertness reshapes how time is experienced. Reflection is replaced by reaction. Depth is replaced by speed. In Islamic prophetic thought, the acceleration of time is not presented as a random symptom of progress. It is described as a sign of transition. Not the end of the world, but the end of an era of stability in human perception. When time speeds up, meaning becomes harder to anchor. Events blur together. Context dissolves. And when context disappears, people become easier to guide, easier to influence, easier to move without fully realizing why. Importantly, these traditions do not claim that the physical length of a day will shorten. The sun will still rise and set as it always has. What changes is the inner experience of time, the human sense of pacing, the ability to slow down, to weigh events against one another, to connect cause and effect. When everything arrives at once, discernment weakens. And where discernment weakens, dependency grows. This is where the idea of a threshold emerges. The year 2026 is not described as a sudden explosion point, but as a convergence, a moment when long-building pressures intersect. Technological acceleration, psychological fatigue, environmental instability, and social fragmentation do not develop in isolation. They reinforce one another. Like streams feeding a single river, they gain force together. Look closely at technology's promise. It claims to save time, to make life more efficient, to free the human mind from repetition. Yet the opposite seems to occur. The more tools designed to save time we adopt, the less time we feel we have. The empty spaces where thought once lived are filled with alerts, updates, and demands for attention. Silence becomes uncomfortable. Stillness feels unnatural, and without stillness, awareness begins to erode. Classical scholars warned that when time accelerates, patience becomes rare. Decisions are made quickly, often emotionally. Long-term thinking is replaced by short-term relief. This environment is not inherently evil, but it is fragile. It creates ideal conditions for powerful narratives to take root. Narratives that promise clarity. Narratives that offer certainty in a world that feels increasingly unmanageable. This is why prophetic traditions often begin not with disasters, but with perception. Before earthquakes shake the ground or rivers dry up, something subtler shifts. The human relationship with time breaks. And once that relationship breaks, everything built upon it becomes unstable. Morality feels negotiable. truth feels relative. Reality itself begins to feel negotiable, shaped less by what is real and more by what is repeated. In this light, 2026 is described less as a date and more as a psychological horizon. A point at which humanity collectively realizes that the old rhythm no longer works, that systems designed for slower eras are struggling to function. Governments, economies, even belief structures strain under the pressure of speed. And when structures strain, people search for guidance, whether wisely or blindly. There is an image often used in classical writing: the calm before a storm. Not silence, but a strange heaviness in the air. The sense that something is approaching, even if the sky has not yet darkened. The acceleration of time functions in the same way. It does not destroy, it warns, it prepares the stage. What makes this moment especially significant is that the acceleration is shared globally. Cultures differ, languages differ, beliefs differ, yet the sensation is nearly universal. People everywhere describe the same feeling: that life is rushing forward without pause, that the present moment barely exists before it is replaced. This shared experience suggests something larger than personal stress or local crisis. It suggests a systemic shift in how reality itself is processed. And here lies the quiet danger. When people feel overwhelmed by speed, they do not ask deeper questions. They look for shortcuts. They accept simplified explanations. They hand over judgment in exchange for relief. This is not because they are weak, but because they are exhausted. And exhaustion is one of the most powerful tools of influence ever known. Prophetic traditions emphasize this moment because it is the foundation upon which everything else is built. Without understanding the acceleration of time, later signs appear disconnected, even exaggerated. But when seen as part of a sequence, they begin to form a pattern. A pattern in which the inner world shifts first, preparing the outer world to follow. Perhaps you have already felt this shift, not as fear, but as unease, a sense that something fundamental has changed even if you cannot name it. That feeling is not a conclusion, it is an invitation. Because before the visible signs arrive, before systems openly fail or truths openly fracture, there is still a choice. A choice in how one moves through accelerated time. Whether to surrender awareness to the current or to slow the mind even as the world speeds up. This is where the story truly begins. Because once time itself feels unstable, the signs that follow will no longer appear distant or symbolic. They will arrive in forms that are impossible to ignore. And when they do, the question will no longer be whether the warnings were real, but whether we were prepared to recognize them when they first appeared. When the prophetic texts speak of signs, they rarely describe them as sudden catastrophes that arrive without warning. Instead, they are presented as shifts in the natural order, changes subtle enough to be dismissed at first, yet persistent enough to demand attention over time. What makes these signs unsettling is not their drama, but their familiarity. When they appear, they do not feel alien. They feel strangely recognizable, as if the world itself is echoing words spoken long ago. Consider the land once known almost exclusively for its barrenness. The Arabian Peninsula has lived in human memory as a place defined by sand, heat, and scarcity. Yet within prophetic tradition, there is a statement that stands out with quiet precision. A time will come when the land of Arabia returns to being green, filled with pastures and flowing water. For centuries, this was understood either spiritually or as a reference to a distant past. Today, it is increasingly difficult to ignore the literal transformation taking place. Unusual rainfall has become more frequent. Regions long associated with drought experience flooding. Satellite images reveal expanding patches of vegetation where sand once dominated. This is not presented here as proof, nor as alarm, but as observation. Climate scientists describe shifting weather patterns. Environmental analysts speak of cycles and anomalies. Prophetic tradition simply notes that when the land changes its nature, it is not meaningless. It is a signal that the balance humans rely on is adjusting. At the same time, the earth beneath our feet has grown restless. Earthquakes are not new, but their frequency and distribution have become a topic of regular discussion. Tremors appear in places unaccustomed to them. Major cities feel vibrations once considered improbable. In prophetic narration, this is not framed as punishment, but as rhythm. The ground moves as the era moves. Stability, once assumed, becomes conditional. Then there is the river that has carried civilizations for thousands of years. The Euphrates has long been more than water. It has been a boundary, a lifeline, a witness to empires rising and falling. Among the most striking prophetic descriptions is the mention that this river will one day recede, revealing something hidden beneath it, something that draws conflict, desire, and bloodshed. Historically, this was often interpreted symbolically. Yet in the present, the physical reality of the river's decline is documented, measured, and debated. Water levels fall due to dams, climate shifts, and overuse. Entire stretches dry out. What lies beneath is not yet the focus. What matters is the pattern. A resource that once sustained life becomes a point of tension. Scarcity transforms geography into temptation. And where temptation grows, so does conflict. Prophetic language does not dwell on the object itself, but on human reaction to it. The true test is not what is revealed, but how humanity responds when it is. Beyond land and water, the signs extend into human health. Disease, in prophetic narration, is not described only as illness of the body, but as a condition of systems. Widespread sickness, sudden outbreaks, and invisible threats that cross borders without permission are described as features of the later stages of history. The modern world has already tasted this reality, not as an abstract idea, but as lived experience. Lockdowns, fear, uncertainty, and the realization that global systems can be halted by something microscopic. What is striking is not that such events occur, but how quickly they reshape behavior. Trust becomes fragile. Authority is questioned or blindly accepted. Communities fracture over interpretations of safety and control. Once again, the sign is not the event itself, but the psychological shift it produces. Fear accelerates compliance. Uncertainty amplifies division. And in that environment, deeper influences gain leverage. Resource stress follows closely behind. Water shortages, food supply disruptions, and competition over energy are no longer hypothetical scenarios discussed in policy papers alone. They are realities shaping diplomatic relations and local survival alike. Prophetic traditions speak of a time when abundance and scarcity coexist unevenly, where wealth concentrates while access diminishes. This imbalance is not portrayed as accidental. It is part of a wider unraveling of equilibrium. Yet none of these signs stand alone. Their power lies in their convergence. A greener desert means altered ecosystems. Increased earthquakes strain infrastructure. Drying rivers ignite geopolitical tension. Disease exposes systemic fragility. Resource stress magnifies inequality. Each phenomenon feeds the next. And together, they form a pattern that feels less like chaos and more like progression. What makes this progression unsettling is its neutrality. There is no villain announced at this stage, no singular enemy to point toward. Nature shifts without malice. Systems strain without intent. Humanity, however, reacts predictably, seeking control, certainty, and protection, even at the cost of awareness. This is where the deeper warning embedded in the signs becomes visible. Prophetic texts often emphasize that people will see these events and still disagree on their meaning. Some will call them coincidence. Others will call them inevitable consequences of progress. A few will sense that something more is unfolding but struggle to articulate it. The signs are not meant to convince everyone. They are meant to reveal who is watching and how they are watching. There is a quiet irony in this stage of the narrative. Never before has humanity possessed so much data, so many instruments, so many models to explain what is happening, and yet never before has meaning felt so elusive. Facts multiply, but understanding fragments. The signs are visible, measurable, undeniable. Interpretation, however, becomes contested terrain. This is not accidental. In prophetic logic, the signs are not designed to force belief. They are designed to test discernment, to see whether people recognize patterns or isolate events, whether they connect causes or treat symptoms, whether they look inward as the world shifts outward. As these signs continue to surface, the ground is quietly being prepared, not for a sudden collapse, but for a new form of influence, a structure capable of offering coherence in the midst of confusion, answers in the midst of uncertainty, direction in the midst of acceleration. When nature becomes unpredictable and systems become fragile, the human desire for stability intensifies. And this is the moment where the narrative begins to change. Because once the signs move from the natural world into the psychological one, once uncertainty becomes a permanent condition rather than a temporary phase, humanity becomes receptive to something more than explanation. It becomes receptive to guidance. Not all guidance will be truthful. Not all clarity will be genuine, but it will be compelling. The signs do not announce what comes next. They only prepare the conditions for it. And as the land changes, the earth trembles, the rivers recede, and human systems strain under their own weight, the stage is being set for a presence that does not arrive through force, but through persuasion. Not through destruction, but through structure. What follows does not emerge from chaos. It emerges from order offered at the right moment. And when that moment arrives, the question will not be whether the signs were real. It will be whether we understood what they were pointing toward before the next phase began. In many retellings, Dajjal is imagined as a singular figure, an individual who appears suddenly, announces himself, and deceives the masses through spectacle alone. But when the classical texts are examined carefully, a more unsettling picture begins to form. The danger is not limited to a man. It is embedded in a structure, a system that prepares the world long before its central figure ever steps forward. Prophetic traditions describe Dajjal as a deceiver, not because he lies constantly, but because he mixes truth with distortion so seamlessly that separation becomes difficult. This is a critical distinction. A falsehood that is obvious rarely lasts, but a narrative that feels logical, helpful, and necessary can reshape reality from the inside. Dajjal, in this understanding, is not merely an entity that arrives. He is the culmination of a process already underway. This is why the texts emphasize preparation. The ground must be ready. Perception must already be unstable. People must already be exhausted, uncertain, and searching for direction. Only then can a system of deception operate at scale. And this system does not rely on brute force. It relies on alignment, on convenience, on solutions that feel like relief. Within this framework, the role of jinn becomes significant. In Islamic cosmology, jinn are beings that exist beyond human perception, capable of movement and influence without being seen. They are not new. They are not invaders. They have always existed alongside humanity. What changes in the later stages of history is not their presence, but their organization. Classical scholars wrote of jinn not as isolated tricksters, but as structured forces with hierarchies, loyalties, and methods of operation. Under Dajjal, they are described as coordinated, purposeful, strategic. This transforms them from curiosities into instruments, not instruments of chaos, but of intelligence gathering, influence, and manipulation. In modern language, this role feels eerily familiar. Information is power. Influence precedes control. The ability to anticipate human behavior is more valuable than the ability to dominate it. Jinn, described as capable of whispering, observing, and transmitting unseen information, fit seamlessly into this logic. They function not as warriors, but as an invisible network. This is where the convergence with technology becomes impossible to ignore. Artificial intelligence is not portrayed as evil in itself. It is portrayed as amplification, a tool that magnifies intention. In a stable moral environment, such tools can serve humanity. In an unstable one, they can accelerate manipulation beyond recognition. The prophetic concern is not that machines become intelligent. It is that intelligence becomes detached from wisdom. Algorithms optimize for engagement, efficiency, and predictability. They do not optimize for truth. When combined with unseen influences capable of reading emotional states and vulnerabilities, the result is a system that understands humans better than humans understand themselves. In this system, deception no longer requires overt lies. It requires selective truth. Information is not hidden. It is filtered. Reality is not denied. It is curated. People are not forced. They are guided. Step by step, choice by choice, until the path feels self-selected. This reframes the idea of Dajjal's miracles. Rain, food, abundance, and security are described not as divine acts, but as conditional offerings. Those who comply receive comfort. Those who resist face scarcity. In a technological age, this does not require supernatural spectacle. It requires access control, resource management, behavioral compliance embedded into daily life. The texts speak of a time when Dajjal will command what appears to be life and death. But life, in this context, may not mean physical survival alone. It may mean participation in the system, visibility, economic access, social existence. And death may not mean immediate destruction, but exclusion, erasure, silence. This is where the system reveals its true nature. It does not announce itself as tyranny. It presents itself as order, as the solution to chaos, as the answer to a world overwhelmed by accelerating time, environmental instability, and psychological fatigue. It offers structure where uncertainty reigns. The role of jinn within this structure becomes clearer here. They are not the face of power. They are the sensors, the observers, the messengers. In modern terms, they function like a surveillance layer beyond human detection, not replacing technology, but complementing it, filling the gaps technology cannot reach. This is why the reimagining of jinn as aliens gains traction in modern culture. Unidentified phenomena, non-human intelligence, beings that move beyond physical constraints. These narratives do not arise randomly. They offer a contemporary language for ancient concepts. They provide a framework that feels scientific enough to be accepted, while remaining mysterious enough to inspire awe. In this way, the system adapts to the era it inhabits. It does not contradict modern understanding. It reframes it. Jinn are no longer spoken of in spiritual terms, but as interdimensional beings. Dajjal is no longer framed as a false messiah, but as an advanced intelligence or global leader offering unity. The essence remains unchanged. Only the vocabulary evolves. What makes this system particularly dangerous is its patience. It does not demand immediate loyalty. It allows skepticism. It tolerates dissent, at least initially. But over time, it reshapes the environment so that resistance becomes increasingly difficult. Not through punishment, but through inconvenience, through isolation, through gradual exclusion from the flow of life. Prophetic warnings emphasize that this phase will feel logical, necessary, even compassionate. The system will claim to reduce suffering, prevent conflict, and stabilize a fractured world. And in many ways, it may succeed, temporarily. This is why the deception is so profound, because it works. The danger does not lie in the system's efficiency, it lies in its cost, the slow erosion of moral agency, the outsourcing of judgment, the quiet replacement of conscience with compliance. Over time, people stop asking whether something is right and begin asking only whether it is allowed. This is why the traditions stress awareness long before confrontation. By the time the system is fully visible, participation may already feel unavoidable. The real test occurs earlier in how people respond to accelerating time, to uncertainty, to the desire for simple answers. Dajjal does not arrive to create chaos, he arrives to manage it. And management, when divorced from truth, becomes control. The system does not need everyone to believe. It only needs enough people to comply and enough others to remain distracted. As the signs of the natural world prepared the physical stage, this system prepares the psychological one. And once the human mind becomes the primary battlefield, influence becomes more effective than force. The question is no longer who rules territory, but who shapes perception. This is where the narrative begins to narrow, because once the system is in place, once guidance is offered in exchange for surrender, the final arena emerges. Not land, not resources, but the inner world of belief itself. And that is where the most decisive struggle unfolds. By the time a system no longer needs force, it has already won half the battle. What remains is refinement, learning how to guide thought without resistance, how to influence emotion without detection, how to shape reality without ever announcing authority. This is why the final arena described in prophetic tradition is not the land, the sky, or even technology itself. It is the human mind. Modern observers often assume that control begins with surveillance, but prophetic descriptions suggest something deeper. True influence does not require watching people at all times. It requires understanding them, knowing what they fear, what they desire, what they will trade certainty for. Once those patterns are known, behavior follows predictably. Choice becomes an illusion, not because it is removed, but because it is anticipated. This is where artificial intelligence takes on a new meaning, not as a machine that thinks, but as a system that learns. It observes human behavior at a scale no civilization has ever possessed. Preferences, habits, emotional responses, moments of weakness, all translated into data. From this data emerges prediction, and from prediction emerges guidance. Not commands, but suggestions. Not orders, but nudges. The prophetic concern is not that AI becomes conscious. It is that consciousness becomes measurable. When emotional states can be detected, analyzed, and influenced in real time, the boundary between internal and external dissolves. Thought no longer feels private. Desire no longer feels spontaneous. Even dissent can be anticipated before it is expressed. This is why the signs increasingly point toward the normalization of mind-machine integration. Devices that respond to emotion. Interfaces that adjust based on mood. Systems that promise mental health, clarity, and balance, while quietly mapping the inner terrain of the user. In isolation, these technologies appear helpful, benevolent even. But prophetic tradition urges attention to pattern, not intent. At the same time, the cultural fascination with unidentified aerial phenomena grows louder. Objects that defy known physics, entities described as non-human intelligence, encounters framed not as threats, but as revelations. These narratives are often presented as scientific curiosity, yet their psychological impact is unmistakable. They expand the boundaries of what people consider possible. They prepare the imagination for authority beyond the human. Within Islamic understanding, this is not unfamiliar territory. Jinn are described as beings that move beyond human sensory limits, capable of appearing and disappearing, influencing perception, and assuming forms that inspire awe. When these ancient descriptions are translated into modern language, they resemble contemporary accounts of non-human intelligence almost perfectly. The terminology changes. The function does not. What matters here is not classification, but timing. These narratives gain traction precisely when trust in human institutions erodes. When governments falter, systems strain, and explanations feel insufficient, the idea of guidance from beyond becomes attractive. Whether framed as advanced beings, higher intelligence, or cosmic neighbors, the effect is the same. Authority is externalized. This convergence, AI shaping behavior on the ground, and non-human intelligence occupying the imagination above, creates a complete psychological enclosure. The inner world is monitored. The outer world is redefined. Humanity stands between two forces that claim knowledge beyond human limitation. And in that space, humility quietly transforms into submission. Prophetic texts describe this stage as one of confusion, where truth and falsehood intertwine so closely that separation becomes exhausting. People do not abandon belief altogether. They replace it with convenience. They accept what feels safe, what feels stabilizing, what reduces cognitive strain. Over time, the effort required to resist becomes greater than the effort required to comply. The symbolism of this stage appears vividly in modern imagery. The covers of influential publications, the repeated presence of brains connected by wires, pills scattered across symbolic landscapes, controllers attached to human consciousness. These are not declarations. They are reflections. Mirrors of collective anxiety and collective aspiration intertwined. What is being communicated is subtle. The future is not ruled by force, but by interface. Whoever controls the interface controls interpretation, controls response, controls reality as it is experienced, and reality, once mediated, can be adjusted. This is why prophetic tradition emphasizes that the deception will not feel hostile. It will feel organized, rational, even compassionate. Systems will promise to reduce suffering, optimize society, and prevent conflict. And for a time, they may succeed. This success is part of the test. Because effectiveness is not the same as truth. The mind becomes the battlefield because it is the last refuge of freedom. Territory can be lost and regained. Resources can be redistributed. But once perception itself is guided externally, resistance becomes incoherent. People no longer know what they are resisting or why. Opposition feels irrational. Doubt feels dangerous. In this environment, language itself begins to change. Words lose stable meaning. Definitions shift depending on context. Moral clarity becomes subjective. What was once unthinkable becomes normalized through repetition. And repetition, when sustained, reshapes belief. Prophetic warnings do not describe mass panic at this stage. They describe quiet adaptation. People adjust to new norms, new interfaces, new expectations. Each change small enough to accept, but cumulative in effect. By the time the system is fully visible, it feels indispensable. The real danger is not loss of freedom in a dramatic sense. It is loss of awareness. When guidance replaces judgment, when automation replaces conscience, when safety replaces truth, the inner compass weakens. And without that compass, even sincere individuals can be led astray without ever feeling coerced. This is why the texts speak of discernment as the greatest defense. Not intelligence alone, not information, but the ability to recognize influence even when it feels helpful, to question clarity that arrives too easily, to remain inwardly anchored while the external world accelerates. As the human mind becomes the central terrain of influence, the narrative reaches its most critical point. Because once perception is shaped, belief follows. And once belief follows, allegiance soon comes after. Not through force, but through agreement. This is the threshold of the final test, not announced by catastrophe, but by comfort, not enforced by fear, but by relief. And when that relief is offered at the right moment, to a world exhausted by speed and uncertainty, the temptation to accept it becomes overwhelming. What remains is the final choice, not between survival and destruction, but between awareness and surrender. And it is in this quiet space, before that choice is made, that the last guidance of prophetic tradition speaks most clearly. As the pressure reaches its highest point, the prophetic narrative does something unexpected. It does not escalate. It softens, the pace slows, the language becomes gentler, and the focus turns inward. This shift is intentional because the final test is not meant to terrify humanity. It is meant to expose what already lives within it. The greatest danger of this final phase is not open oppression or visible destruction. It is comfort, a carefully engineered calm that arrives after prolonged uncertainty. When people are exhausted by speed, instability, and constant change, relief feels like salvation. And when relief is offered without chains or threats, it is rarely questioned. Prophetic tradition warns that the final deception does not demand that people abandon their beliefs outright. Instead, it encourages delay, compartmentalization. Faith is allowed to exist, but only in private. Conscience is tolerated, but only if it does not interfere with efficiency. Over time, this quiet separation weakens conviction without ever confronting it directly. The response offered by these traditions is strikingly simple. There is no call for mass resistance, no dramatic confrontation with power. The guidance turns inward. It speaks of the heart before the system, of awareness before action. Because a structure built on influence loses its power when it encounters individuals who cannot be internally divided. Faith here is not described as blind belief or emotional escape. It is described as orientation, a way of anchoring meaning when external reference points constantly shift. When truth becomes negotiable and reality feels curated, faith serves as an internal compass, not to reject the world, but to move through it without losing direction. Alongside faith comes discernment, the ability to pause when everything urges speed, to question clarity that arrives too easily, to recognize that repetition does not equal truth, and consensus does not equal wisdom. In an age where narratives are optimized for emotional impact, restraint becomes a form of strength. This does not require withdrawal from technology or isolation from society. It requires conscious engagement, choosing depth over immediacy, silence over noise when possible, reflection over reaction. These are not dramatic acts, but they are cumulative. Over time, they restore the inner rhythm that accelerating time seeks to dissolve. As the narrative approaches its end, it does not conclude with catastrophe. It concludes with responsibility, the understanding that the future is shaped less by singular events than by countless individual choices. How information is consumed, how fear is processed, how truth is treated when it becomes inconvenient. In this light, 2026 is not presented as an ending, but as a revealing moment, a test that brings underlying tendencies to the surface. The systems, the signs, the technologies, and the pressures converge not to erase humanity, but to ask something of it. Will awareness be traded for ease? Will certainty be chosen over truth? Will comfort outweigh conscience? The tradition leaves these questions unanswered, because the answers are not written into prophecy. They are written into people. As the noise recedes and the pace finally slows enough to notice, one quiet truth remains. Guidance has always been present, not as force, not as control, but as clarity. A steady light available to those willing to look inward even as the world pulls outward. And in the end, that choice, made quietly, individually, and continuously, is what defines the outcome of every era,